Well, welcome and thank you for coming. The topic of conversation tonight is a recent effort that we've undertaken concerning the Underground Railroad. I believe everybody understands what the Underground Railroad was, but I'll be honest, myself, I always thought of it as an item taking place out east, Harriet Tubman and all that. It was a subject matter over that way. I never thought of the Underground Railroad actually coming through Illinois. Illinois was a part of the Underground Railroad, was an important part. We estimate 800 enslaved individuals passed through Tazewell County on their way to freedom. So just this portion of the Underground Railroad had quite a bit of foot traffic. We know that the Underground Railroad began in Delavan, entered Tazewell County in Delavan.
Oh, thank you.
Yep. And then came up through Dylan, the old Circleville area, came up through Tremont, through Morton, went around Washington as best they could, sometimes through, but most of the time around Washington. I'll cover that in a minute. And then to the George Kern farm, right as you leave Tazewell County to enter Woodford County. Back then it was Tazewell County. But as you left to go into currently Woodford on Washington Blacktop, there's a Lincoln Memorial monument for him saying Lincoln rode the circuit here. That is a little further north of that is where George Kern's farm was at. And he was the last stop in the Tazewell County current day network. Important thing to remember with the Underground Railroad is these are individuals coming up any way they could. There may have been a case of one of them obtaining a horse somewhere, but most of the time they were on foot. They were being shuttled by carriage that the individuals of the Underground Railroad owned from one property to the next, but sometimes they also wandered to those properties on foot. They traveled from, in Illinois, they would have been coming from Louisiana, Mississippi, maybe Texas, but Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, coming up through that network that way. Their goal was to get to Canada. As soon as they reached Canada, it being a British colony, they knew they would have freedom. So that was their goal in going northward. The conductors on the route knew I was taking them in and who was one before me, and I take them to this house, so I know that one. But we don't believe that they knew much else about where they went beyond that. It was completely secretive because it was illegal. While Illinois was always a free state, there was extensive laws that made harboring slaves illegal. The minimum fine was $1,000, which for a rural farmer back then was a hefty price. And worse yet, it was a minimum 6 months in jail. You take a farmer out of the field for 6 months out of the year, I don't care where it's at on the calendar, you've killed his harvest. And farmers live harvest to harvest. So this was a direct threat to their livelihood to be participating in this activity. So that's why the research is so difficult today. There isn't these markers of this family did this and this family. You hear legend, you hear gossip, you hear family stories, sometimes written down, sometimes not. And then it's our job to take and try to verify that through multiple sources, some of which I'll show tonight. And by verifying it through multiple sources, then we can sit down and say that this is what we believe to be accurate. The list that I handed you are where we're currently at today. These are the individuals that participated in the Tazewell County system. Now, one name has already been added to this list that was not on here when I printed this 2 days ago, and that was Levi Matthews, Josiah Matthews' son in Tremont. We kept hearing, didn't find about him until we started re-researching Josiah Matthews for an upcoming program in June and found reference to his son. We'll then track down who his son would have been. He's never given credit, but he was on all of these trips with his father. He was involved in the activity, so we're adding his name to the list as well. But here again, his father's mentioned prominently in the national books, but then his son not, because the father would have taken the attention at the time through the family legends and that, but the son in our account should have a marker as well. Another one that was just added a little bit ago tonight. You've got in the library here the first principal's desk from the old Crandall School. The Crandall School here in Morton was very prominent, very well known. A lot of Mortonites went to school through Crandall School. It also was on neighbored Uriah Crosby's property, was on Uriah Crosby's old property. It was near the Roberts family's property. And according to that, Crandall himself, whose homestead was at the intersection of Tennessee and Harding, was, it's listed over there, a member of the Underground Railroad. Well, he's not one on our list because we haven't seen his name until tonight. So we will, it makes sense because Crandall Station and the Crandall family surrounded the Crosbys. But we couldn't verify that until we find a couple more cross references. But now we've got a clue. So to show you how this works, we've got one reference, a clue. Now I'll go back and I'll search the records and try to find more written proof detailing Crandall's activity with the Underground Railroad. And if we can do that, collaborate it in a couple different manners, then we'll add their name to the listing. I have no reason to doubt what's written down over there, but we feel it's important to try to cross-check with a couple different references. Sometimes the story we hear seems a little too good to be true. One of them I'll share with you tonight seemed that way, and we didn't have the gentleman on the list for a while. Actually, his story checks out. When we connect a few additional historical markers, the story makes sense. And I'll get to that story in a minute because it's really an interesting one. References that we use, I think I'll cover the research real quick a bit. One of the more important ones is it's hard to get a good plat map. Now we're talking 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. Slows down drastically in the 1850s because the national conversation is really getting heated. And then in the 1960s with the Civil War, the Underground Railroad kind of comes to a halt. There's still a trickle, but really the period we're talking about is the 30s, 1830s, and 1840s. You got to remember, Morton doesn't exist then. Evans Corner does. Evans Corner was located at what would have been today the intersection of Harding and North Main Street in Morton. So this history predates the village of Morton itself. Uriah Crosby, one of the more prominent members here of the Morton circuit, was one of the first individuals to move into Morton Township and to be settling it. He built the second school in Morton Township as a way of enticing individuals to come to Morton and settle near his home. That was on the site where Crandall School later would be built. We do not believe that is Crandall School. The details of what school he built there are kind of sketchy, but we find it highly unlikely that the Crandall School, memory of everybody's, is not the same school, but was built on the exact same site where Uriah Crosby's school was built. So the first thing that we'll start with that when we look is trying to get a lay of the land. And the old plat books, especially this one, it comes in extraordinarily handy. Now this one, if I remember right, is 1979, which is the oldest plat book that we can get. Yeah, remember these are all hand-drawn. So getting this one, you can find this one online. This one, your library happens to have a wonderful copy of as well.
You said 1979?
Sorry, 1879. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Slip of the tongue.
Yeah.
It has a wonderful layout, and it shows Uriah Crosby's farmstead being at the intersection of what today would be, and this is where we believe his home was, Cortland and North Main Street, so just to the north of Evans Corner. Matter of fact, right where the intersection is where I believe his farmstead, where his home was. If not there, it's just a little to the north, maybe on that where the for sale sign is now on that property. But that is where Uriah Crosby's farmstead was. It did at one point, for this map, it comes all the way down to Evans Corner. He did have that for a little while, and then he sold it to the Ackerman family, and they took that property over. And by the time we get to the next edition in the 1880s, that they've moved there. This map has, this is some of the difficulties we find. By this period, we're already, remember I said 1830s, 1840s, well in 30 years a lot goes on. And we see that. My family's moved in here. They weren't here until 1836, and they were in Groveville, and then they didn't come here until the 1850s. And they were further up north, but on this map they've moved right across from Uriah Crosby. The Roberts are there. They're all around Uriah Crosby. So is Crandall with Crandall Station. So we start to use those landmarks then to try to understand what's shown on this map. Where is it on a current township map today? Because again, Morton didn't exist at this time. You've got just the beginning of Morton down here, the little triangle. That's it. Evans Corner is still shown, the old Stagecoach Junction, so we can use that as a point of reference. We try to figure it out off that then. But these are extraordinarily, especially this edition, extraordinarily helpful in being able to locate these. Another research tool that came in handy, this is my version, my book. This is a remake, though, of this book, which your library has, which is the original 1879 History of Tazewell County. It is a wonderful reference book. The first chapter, first part of it is divided into two chapters. The first chapter deals with the history of Illinois, and then the second part is the history of Tazewell County. So you're going from Tazewell County's founding in 1827 to 1879. So you have some wonderful indexes of the first elected officials for each township, for each village, for the county itself. It also has an in-depth chapter on the Underground Railroad activity, because by then, the Civil War's over, they're proud to start discussing. So we started finding some of our scraps sprinkled through here. Uriah Crosby has a section in here, so does Josiah Matthews. A couple of the others are mentioned as well. One, to give you an example, the Roberts family is mentioned in here, but then they're not really discussed in depth. That was one where we had to cross-check with others to find out, okay, how did the Roberts family tie in? So this was a wonderful book, and again, is one that your library does have. A third reference that's come in handy in book form is The Underground Railroad by Mary Ellen Snodgrass. It's a national book. This one I actually bought from a former library. They had released it, and I bought it secondhand through them. Does have the checkout one, but that's not mine. As a matter of fact, I think the library was in Michigan, if I remember right. Yeah, Allegiant, Michigan is where this came from. So this library released this book, and I picked them up. It's a two-part series, but it covers the national part of the Underground Railroad, so a fuller version of it. Shows some of the trails that they know of, landmarks it discusses. It takes apart family stories. As you see here, it says, Encyclopedia of People, Places, and Operations, and it does a fantastic job of detailing what research that she could come up with. Now, for the Tazewell County section, just to give you an idea, she'll cover Josiah Matthews and Tremont. She'll cover Uriah Crosby, and she mentions the Roberts family, but doesn't have a section for them. So again, that shows you the research trail can be kind of choppy sometimes. We verify then online, also trying to track down family stories, family documentation to verify all of this. That's kind of the research that we've done to try to dive into this. I will also mention this research isn't just mine. This research has been done before. Former history teacher in Pekin, Dale Kuntz, passed away now, but he was a member of the Genealogical Society of Tazewell County. He detailed a lot of this research 10, 20 years ago. And really that's where I got started on this, was the Genealogical Society updated, had a manuscript that they have a copy of that was given to them. That was the history of the Amish Mennonites in America. And it detailed the families that were involved in that. Well, Ackerman's would have been one of them, so I wanted to update our family tree if I see what information was in there. And I was just, as happens often with research, you go down one trail and then you see another rabbit hole and you dive down that one. So I shuffled over to the Roth family, and it referenced that one of the Roth sisters that immigrated here stayed with Uriah Crosby, who at his farm, and of course Uriah Crosby, who's well known for the Underground Railroad. And that's the first time that had caught my eye, Underground Railroad. No, that's out east. What do you mean Uriah? I don't even know who Uriah Crosby was. So that's what got my attention. So I left that book and started trying to find out what I could about Uriah Crosby, Underground Railroad, and Morton. Found these other reference points, and our research kind of went from there. Dale Kuntz's was one that popped up to me because he had all of his records were being held by the Genealogical Society. All of his research. When he died, they took possession of it. So his records I dove through. One of the presentations he made in Pekin at one of their meetings 20 years ago struck me. And his words were, the research, the information is available. You just have to know where to find it. And as long as there are individuals that are speaking of it, we will be able to find it. But sadly, there are no permanent markers to indicate what these individuals did. So after we pass, if our stories aren't continued to be told, this history will disappear. It will remain in form, but nobody will know where to get it. Now, to me, referencing back to the library, that was the genius of the card catalog back in my day when I was growing up. The card catalog had everything you needed to know about where to find items. Well, why not have a card catalog for what took place in Tazewell County with the Underground Railroad? So that's where the idea came for marking the grave sites of these individuals. It would be an index card to tell you that Uriah Crosby was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Well, what do you mean? Well, you'd go on and you could, in the future, they'll Google it and they'll be able to see, here's Uriah Crosby, here's some stories about him, and that will be the index card in the card catalog, leading people to this research into the future. So that's what we're trying to do throughout Tazewell County here over the next, what we plan to be for the next year, year and a half, is marking all of these grave sites, not touching the gravestone itself because of the age that we don't want to do that. But we're leaving a little aluminum marker that says, as a matter of fact, it's the emblem you see at the top of your page there, Underground Railroad Freedom Train Conductor. And that'll be right beside each of their gravestones so that future generations have a clue to what these individuals accomplished. Here in Morton, we're talking about mainly Uriah Crosby, as you read in the newspaper, and the Roberts family. The Roberts family, there were 4 brothers and a father. Daniel, Darius, Daniel was the father. Darius, Walter, Ambrose, and John were the sons. John Roberts is very important to Morton's foundation as a township. He serves, matter of fact, it's detailed in the history book for the township. He's one of the first treasurers, one of the first assessors, one of the first clerks. His name as community organizers all over the place. He also founded the church right down here in downtown Morton. Remind me at the 4 corners there with the bells. United Church of Christ, I believe. That church was founded by him. It was one of them that he was a founding member of. So he was very active in the early stages of building Morton, of wanting to have the town develop. I have no written record of this, but when you read of whenever you read of Crosby, you read of the Roberts brothers helping out, doing the labor, going to get the cargo, moving the cargo, assisting. Being somebody knowing, how my dad was with me and my brother, him and his buddies would sit around and talk about a project they're going to work on, and Darius and the father, Daniel, and Uriah were about the same age. So I picture them like my parents, my dad and his buddies sitting on the porch talking about this big project. And then Dad always waving, yeah, the boys over there, they'd be happy to do it. Come on, you guys can. So I imagine John and his brothers being the ones that they brought over to actually do the labor. I never find a reference to Uriah himself transporting enslaved individuals. They'd stay at his house, but not transporting them physically himself. It's always the Robert brothers that are moving the cargo from Tremont here to Morton, and from Morton up to George Kern's in Washington, north of Washington. So again, there's no written record of that, but that's just something I envision in my mind as probably how that whole system worked out. We do know from, thankfully, one of the nice things about this is Uriah Crosby's great-great-granddaughter was here for our event last week, and she explained some of the family stories that she had. She mentioned on their side that they had a trap door in the log cabin. They put a rug over the top of that and put the baby carriage, and that's where her great-grandfather was during this period. He was a baby, so they put him in the crib with the idea that the bounty hunters, which were active in Tazewell County bounty hunters, that they wouldn't move the baby, disturb the baby, and he would smoke a cigar over the baby, trying to throw the scent off of individuals in the house. Something she mentioned was that, and I think it was in the newspaper column, was that her great-grandfather hated for the rest of his life cigars. And they wondered if it was the imprint that fear came along with it. No way to know that for sure. We find that with a lot of these family stories. There's no way to prove it. I don't know if it's really our job to try to prove a family story, but to accept it for what it is and allow the research to remain like that. She also mentioned about washing down the mules that they would use. He had a special buggy that he would, a carriage, that was deeper than it appeared. So they had a board that would set over the top, and then they'd put straw or hay or some sort of product on the top of it so that the individuals were actually underneath, and that but the depth was thrown off that way where you couldn't tell. It looked like a full wagon, but it really wasn't. False bottom, I guess, is what you could look for. One of the more humorous stories I found was described that Uriah Crosby had a heavy cargo delivery one evening. The two individuals were of too much size to fit into his hidden cargo on his wagon. So he allowed them, husband and wife, to set up with him. Hefty size and heavy. I found the terms humorous trying to think of how large these individuals must have been, husband and wife. He did say that the entire trip from his home the next day to Washington, that the family rode up with him, and that the wife was reciting Bible passages, reading the Bible. And that family Bible was the only thing that they carried with them their entire pathway to freedom. One of the sadder times on the Underground Railroad took place as John Roberts tried to transport a cargo load of enslaved individuals from Tremont here to the Crosby farm in Morton. The bounty hunters stopped and accosted him and searched the wagon and found a wife and two children. The husband and the oldest child were walking behind the wagon. They couldn't fit five on there. And they were much further behind that they couldn't be seen. The bounty hunters quickly took the wife and the two younger children, carried them to Pekin, threw them on a riverboat, and down the river they went to St. Louis to be sold on the auction block. And that's where we lose their trails when they're sold back into slavery. The husband and older child made it to the Crosby farm, spent the night. There's nothing else you can do other than continue on, so they continued onward. That is why they avoided Pekin. It wasn't about the city itself, but it was that Pekin was a river town. And they tried their best to avoid river towns because it was too easy to be thrown on a riverboat and sent downstream. The reason that was the fear, these are bounty hunters. They're hired to come get the runaway slaves and take them back. But, like anything else, they get more money if they actually resell the cargo in St. Louis back into slavery rather than taking the time to return it all the way back down south. So bounty hunters this far north, that's what we see, is that they would get them on a riverboat, get them down, make the buck the quickest way they can, which is selling them on the auction block back in St. Louis. It's just the reality of what took place. There was a family story of Uriah Crosby's as well, one that she mentioned. I'll repeat it, but again, we have no documentation. We would never have documentation of this taking place. But the sheriff at the time was the family friend of the Crosbys. So he would purposely bring bounty hunters to their farm because he's a family friend. He can, direct the way that they're looking at things. But then that would make it where, if he's bringing us here, it must not be them. Well, they searched the barn, couldn't find anything, and took off. Later that evening, the bounty hunters wanted to circle back, and they came back to the Crosby farm. Horatio was Uriah Crosby's oldest son. He heard a disturbance and went outside to see what the disturbance was, and one of the bounty hunters shot Horatio. The family story that she explained was that Horatio was brought into the kitchen. It's a one-room cabin, so please don't imagine a grandiose kitchen. It's everything's like a one-room cabin in the same room, but brought him into the kitchen area. His mother grabbed a red-hot poker out of the fireplace, cauterized the wound right there, and he lived. But this sheriff apologized deeply to the family and swore that he would never bring bounty hunters to their farm again, and he never did. Again, these are family legends. We can't verify them. None of that would ever be written down. But we take it for what it is and imagine accept it for at face value for what it is. Horatio, just so you know, would go on to fight in the Civil War. So the Crosby family did not just believe in this and not have anything invested. They invested their oldest son's life going down and fighting in the Civil War. He would be with Grant at Fort Donelson, where Grant gets the name Unconditional Surrender, but his unit was right behind, so they weren't actually in the action there. He was at Corinth or Shiloh, bloody battle, but again, coming right afterwards. At Vicksburg time catches up with him, though, and his unit, Horatio, is in the midst of the Battle of Vicksburg, one of the units that gets decimated the most. He survives. He gets injured in the war, but survives, comes back home, and owns quite a bit of farmland to the north of Morton, along with his father. He later, John Crosby, the infant that was in the crib, he, of course, was a baby, so he isn't involved in the Civil War, but later his family, which the descendant that spoke here, she's from his side of the family, moved to Minnesota. The family story with him I thought was humorous was I guess he turned into later in life a family genealogist, in that anybody named Crosby has to be related to me somehow. So when he found out that you lived, if he was in a town and found out there's a Crosby, I want to meet him and find out how we're related. So he took the time to do that. Well, one of his journeys, he'd heard gossip that there's a Dr. Crosby in Canada. Well, I'm in Minnesota, he's in Canada, ain't that far. Calls up and he makes an appointment to meet with Dr. Crosby. So he crosses into Canada and goes to Dr. Crosby, and can't be related because then walks a gentleman that's African American. Well, we can't be related then if you're there. And they have a nice laugh, and he explains, I really wasn't here, I just wanted to see, but African Americans aren't in our family tree that I know of. So then he goes, well, no, our family took a surname from another family. See, our family came on the Underground Railroad through Illinois, and one of the families in Illinois was so compassionate and so caring for us that our families took their surname as our family. Well, lo and behold, we must be related then, because there isn't another Crosby that we know of on the Underground Railroad. So I thought she didn't share that one publicly too much, but when she told me that, I was like, what a special connection to the Underground Railroad and the activities. She didn't explain much more of where that family was or what became of them. I imagine they stayed in some contact, though. But again, just a nice tell of how these individuals remembered those that helped them out. We did our event here in Morton at the cemetery, recognizing Uriah Cosby on his 210th birthday, and the Roberts family. We don't have the plaques made up yet, the aluminum placards. They're being manufactured now by Tazewell Machine Works, which is generously working with us to lower the cost as best as possible. They still got to make it, so it still costs something. And I got to say, there is a business owner here in Morton, a prominent business owner, that stepped forward. The most expensive part is casting the mold, the cost of the mold, which is about $3,000. He wants to remain anonymous, but he covered the cost of the mold. So each one of these will be about $100 a piece, which isn't too much to ask for to have a lasting impact on history. So we're going to pay for all of the individuals to have their grave sites that you see on that page marked. And if we find Crandall's and we're able to collaborate his, as we add more, it's not a complete research study, it's still in the works, but as we find more, we'll add more to it. Our next goal is going to be in Tremont. We will be next in June around the Turkey Festival. We'll hold it. That'll be recognizing Josiah Matthews, John Albert Jones, Freeman Kingman, and Absalom Dylan. A little preview of that one. Josiah Matthews is listed as on Elm Grove, but he was really along Springfield Road, so close to Tremont, but that part is in Elm Grove Township. His farm was, like Uriah Crosby's, one of the main depots for the passage of individuals. John Albert Jones was a friend of Abraham Lincoln's, a very prominent, outspoken abolitionist. His mansion in Tremont is the only remaining structure that we can verify was part of the Underground Railroad. Now, he's in town, so it wasn't the main depot. Like I said, that was Josiah Matthews out in the country. Again, you want to stay away from heavy trafficked areas. And at this point in time, Tremont is the courthouse for Tazewell County, not Pekin. So there would have been a lot of attention, it's unlikely they had many there, but we do know they had some at their residence. More important, we know that Abraham Lincoln spent the night at that house. We know that his friend Attorney Davis from Bloomington spent the night there. We know Stephen Douglas visited the home when he was speaking here. Lots of prominent individuals of that era spent time at that home in Tremont. Freeman Kingman, we're still researching and finding as much as we can on him. He seems to be a prominent labor individual, more like the Roberts family, helping transportate the enslaved individuals from The last one's kind of an interesting gentleman. Absalom Dylan. His older brother, Nathaniel Dylan, is the first settler of Tazewell County. He is the first individual to come in and build a homestead and settle what was then the Wild West of Illinois in Dillon Township. His grave is prominently marked in Dillon Township. Absalom comes a year later. He's the younger brother. Now before that, he's living in Springfield, north of Springfield in Sangamon County. They came from the south, not from the east, like other families did. And that was important when I get here to the story. So the story we found to lead us on his path said that he had been leading a group of enslaved individuals, much too large to go to his residence, so he hid them in a patch of woods nearby. The next morning he went back and found that they were gone, but saw hoof prints, meaning that, like the bounty hunters have. Well, he starts out after the bounty hunters. Now, we also hear quite a bit of tale that he was fierce tempered. He was a little on the grouchy side every once in a while, and didn't have a problem expressing that frustration. So he went out after the bounty hunters. When he found them crossing the Sangamon River, he pulled out his pistols and charged them, shooting at the bounty hunters, chasing them off, and took his enslaved individuals back north towards freedom. Now, when I heard that story, I was like, too good to be true. Come on now. In the Sangamon River, you left from Dillon Township and you went all the way to the Sangamon. That's a 2-3 day ride on horseback. It's got too many holes. So we didn't accept it. We read it, put it to the side. Now, when you see the family history, before they settled in Tazewell, they're down in Sangamon. They're north of Springfield, north of the Sangamon River. Now it's starting to make sense. And we started to look and we realized, well, that story had no date or time. We started finding it cross-referenced several other times, meaning more than likely it is a true story. And when you tie in the fact that they didn't come here until later, they settled down there, it must have taken place when they were down closer to the Sangamon River where the story could actually make sense then. That was the one I was telling you about. Sometimes you're reading, you think it's too good to be true, and then when a couple other details get connected, you're like, now I see where that can make sense. So we do believe that story is true. We do believe that took place, though, before he settled in Tazewell County. We do know he came up a year after his brother. And again, they're some of the originals, so they're in the 1820s. So in that time frame, they're down there further. It's easy to start making those connections. So he'll be one that'll be interesting to tell that story and get people's reaction. We're planning on in September being in Delavan then, and that'll honor the Delavan and South Pekin vicinity individuals. I told you that Pekin itself was avoided because it was a river town. And we do know that Pekin did lean more Democrat, more slavery, pro-slavery, than it did abolitionist. The county itself was 60-40 in the 1840s, 1850s, going into the Civil War. I will say, though, as soon as the Civil War begins, Tazewell County put out way more than its quota of individuals into the Civil War. So we may have been 60-40, but Tazewell County puts out more than its fair share of individuals receiving the calling, entering, volunteering into the service. So many that not only did we fill the quota for Tazewell County, but we fill up the quota for Peoria County, and then they decide, we got to get into the war, but the quota's filled. What do? Let's go to St. Louis. So a huge group of them go down to St. Louis and join the Missouri Volunteers entering into the Civil War. So we should be proud. We have over 900 individuals, military discharge records from the Civil War in our office, in the Recorder of Deeds office, including 3 of them that would be cited with the Medal of Honor for their actions at the Battle of Vicksburg. So Tazewell County did its fair share, regardless of how that math was beforehand. But I bring that up with Pekin because for the Delavan one, we're going to have Daniel and Dr. Daniel Cheever. They are 2 separate, that's not a typo. Daniel's the father and Dr. Daniel is the son. Daniel Cheever, his home was in Pekin. His doctor's office was right across from the current courthouse in Pekin. So he's a prominent member of Pekin society, yet he is associated with the Underground Railroad. He is an extraordinarily active, outspoken member of the abolitionist organization. He's also, I don't know how many know what the Union League was or what it still is today. Are you familiar with that? Union leagues were started during the Civil War to counter the fact that the war was going poorly. They were basically they were lobbyists, sending out information about how wonderful the cause is, how we need to support the Union Army. And hard times in the beginning of the war wasn't going the side of the Union. So this group was organized. Clubs were set up in major cities. There is still a Union League in downtown Chicago. It's a prominent societal club. There's one in Philadelphia that's extraordinarily prominent. D.C. still got one. They really took off with Reconstruction of the South. They placed them in all that. That was born in Tazewell County in Pekin, in Daniel Cheever's upstairs office. He held the first Union League meeting there, came up with the idea for this, him and the state's attorney of Tazewell County, the sheriff of Tazewell County, several others. So Pekin had individuals of great character that wanted to stand forward. Others as well would be, later on that list, you see Samuel and Hugh Woodrow of Circleville. They are two of the founding members of the city of Pekin. As a matter of fact, Ann Eliza and Elizabeth streets are named after their wives. They had their farm, though, in Circleville. That's where they lived. So did William Woodrow of South Pekin. He's another member of the family that was prominent in Pekin. So you can't color communities with a broad paintbrush. You got to remember that regardless of what the character thought of the character of the town is, there were strong individuals in each of these communities that stood forward. But we'll be honoring those gentlemen along with George Teft, whose farm was in Delavan there. And then we'll end this in April of next year in Washington, Illinois. Washington's it's one of the largest cities in Tazewell County during this period. That's why they would have avoided it. That's a major trade station. That's a major area. Plus, it was settled by individuals from the South, so it does have more of a leaning towards pro-slavery. There we'll be recognizing George Kern, the gentleman whose farm we talked about, along with James Patterson and J. Randolph Scott. J. Randolph Scott was one of, again, the leading abolitionists in Tazewell County, though extraordinarily outspoken individual in the city of Washington. The reason we're waiting until next year for the one in Washington is it will recognize the 160th anniversary of when J. Randolph Scott and George Kern were arrested for harboring slaves in the city of Washington. They were taken to court in Tremont. Their trial was held there. Their defense attorney was Abraham Lincoln. And it is the last case that Abraham Lincoln took involving slavery. He got the charges dismissed for lack of evidence and brought up actually two other cases from the circuit. One from Menard County, if I remember right, and I can't remember where the third one was from, but he actually got those cases transferred. After the first two were dismissed because of lack of evidence, the judge knew which direction he was heading and just outright threw the case out and said, we know what your defense is going to be and you'll win, so here you go, just take all three and go home. So all three cases were dismissed, and those are the last cases Abraham Lincoln took involving slavery. So that's why we're waiting until next year to recognize them. Does, though, again, raise that curtail, can we call this heroic? Can we call these actions courageous? They were illegal. These were individuals that were standing up, counter the law. But I think when you see the risk they took, when we look at it today, we know that that cause was just and was right, that they were doing what needed to be done. So I think it's fair that we honor these gentlemen as heroic, as courageous. They did risk something. Two of them were arrested. That could have been their livelihoods. They were dismissed, but still, the risk was there. We know from what I told you already, John Roberts was accosted. He could have been easily shot. He could have easily been wounded. Horatio Crosby was shot at his home for trying to investigate a disturbance. So the danger was real. And I guess that's the point I was trying to make with this part of the discussion. I think I've said it a couple times, but just reiterating, the research is not closed. None of us are professing that it'll probably ever be closed because there's just too much that we don't know. This was all secret, all family gossip, all family. There's still stories we don't know about that are out there. And when we do, like tonight when I found the history of Crandall's, we'll research that and we'll try to track it down. So it's an endeavor that'll probably continue forward. Well, I appreciate your time. I hope you saw some value in it. The library always has wonderful references. Other libraries do as well. What questions can I answer for you?
There's a combined, the Tazewell County Genealogical Society's got a combined plat book.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes through dates. I got a copy of it, but I don't remember the dates.
There's that's over here as well. And
Is that
maybe
it?
this version here. Yeah, 1864, 1873, and 1891 is this one. But there's another three-part book over there too from the 1910, 1920, and 1930s, I think. I'm pulling that from memory, but this is the older of them. Yeah.
So are you having the families, like this lady you were talking
Yeah.
about, are you having them put anything into writing? Will they do that?
What we didn't put into writing, what we did is Mayor Kaufman, when he found out that she was, let me back up how we found her. She found us.
Or where does she?
She lives in Naples, Florida.
Oh.
And she just happened to be Googling her family she was bored sitting there in Florida and was just Googling one morning, and by the time she called us midday, she'd already had airline tickets bought. You're going to be recognizing my great-great-grandfather. I want to be there. I know this history of the Underground Railroad. We shared it. So she found us because I had dismissed finding a relative. When I did the research for the Medal of Honor for Thomas Murphy, I wanted to find a living relative. Well, you start trying to find out where they're at, and it's just hard to do. We got lucky with that. I found a Thomas Murphy in Salt Lake City that was described as being a relative of the Thomas Murphy buried here. Well, maybe I'll get lucky. How do you find it? Well, I'm a county clerk. I'll call the county clerk in Salt Lake City. So I shot in the dark and called him. And, well, actually, we don't keep telephone numbers. But, oh, actually, we do have his telephone number. Well, it ended up not being his, but being his daughter's. But she got me to him. And then he goes, not only am I a relative, I'm the relative with the history. We've got his Medal of Honor right here hanging on our family wall. And he goes, nobody else in the family sees the value in this. I've got it. Nobody sees it. Do y'all have a museum up there? And I'm like, yes, we do. Well, how about I mail it to you and you put it in your museum? So we have Dr. Murphy's Medal of Honor that he received for the Battle of Vicksburg in the museum across from the courthouse, the Tazewell County Historical Museum. Needle in the haystack, though. What was the odds of that? This was the exact same way. By the time she found us, that's a shot of the dark. That got lucky. She called us and had the airline tickets, willing to travel. Hey, okay. So she came up on her own expense. So when Mayor Kaufman found out about that, he arranged with the chamber for her to sit down. Morton has outstanding video stories of history of Morton. So there is now going to be a new chapter. She did a huge segment on Crosby's, the family history that she knew. Some of those stories I shared were ones that she related there as well. So yes, there will be a record that she's put down for the future, not written on video, but right there with the rest of the wonderful Morton history videos that the community's been so blessed to have. And thank Mayor Kaufman for that idea, because he asked, and it was the day before, so I was like, hey, our presentation's at 4, at 2, can we meet at the, oh, okay. So she sat down and we shot it real quick, and it worked out real well. But now for the others, we'll try. I can't tell you how many times though we're gonna get that lucky. It's not something I would count on. I mean, that was just really a stroke of luck. Now, I do believe though, the Tremont Historical Society has really taken an interest in their section for June. So I believe they are working with some of the Matthews relatives that are still in the area, Josiah Matthews. And there's been some talk of some of the Jones relatives that are still in the area possibly participating. So it may happen. It's just a matter of getting the word out and seeing how lucky we get. But I can't guarantee that every time. So what other questions can I answer?
Would Deer Creek or Mackinac by chance have been part of the Underground Railroad system?
You know, it could have been. There's no way. Again, there's nothing. I'm never going to say that it wasn't.
Right.
Pekin. Is there a chance that Dr. Cheever's house in downtown Pekin, that a slave stayed there? Absolutely, there's a chance. Unlikely, because of it being a river town, they would have avoided it. But maybe one stumbled in, and he has. You just don't dismiss it. You know what I mean? There isn't, and again, it's important to remember. There's not a main. They're doing this on word of mouth. They're traveling different routes, different ways. So you never. I'll never say no, but Mackinac was one of the major towns, so they would have tried to avoid that one as well.
Okay.
And you got to remember about how hard it is to cross the Mackinac River in that time.
Yeah, that's right.
You've got a couple forges, but you don't have a lot. So, and where there's a heavy forge with a large town, you're trying to avoid that because of the way it goes. Now, Tremont would have been one because the individual that took that ferried across the Mackinac River on the path to Tremont was a Quaker, was an abolitionist. So he was a known individual that would remain quiet. Again, though, I don't want to say maybe in the McLean County sections they have something, but here I don't have anything at this time for Deer Creek or from Mackinac.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Do we have a record anywhere of like any structures that are still standing today that we could just like drive around and look at them?
Yeah, the only one well, not that you can just drive around and look at. The only, I mean, you can see it, but I'm not going to offer you a tour of somebody's home right now. But the Jones Mansion in Tremont is the only one that's still standing that we know for a fact that there is a trap door there to a crawl space under the home. That's where the slaves would have stayed. That one we can, you will be able to touch history there. There isn't anything else like that that we can confirm. I will say, my aunt and uncle's home, the greenhouse on Harding Road, the green farmhouse right before the railroad tracks, it's Mel and Thelma Ackerman's. That home would have been the Roberts farmstead. The Roberts family we talked about was neighbors of Uriah Crosby's, were in the Underground Railroad. The foundation of that home is much older than the structure that you see today. Could that be? There's my cousins have all mentioned to me there's a possibility. Yes, there is. I can't confirm it. It is where the Roberts farmstead was. That was their home. So there's a chance. There is a barn in Elmhurst that still is a stop on the Underground Railroad. We know that. In Peoria, the Pettigrew House was extraordinarily popular. Again, though, being a river town, I don't think they saw the traffic that we saw here because it would have been easy to throw them on a riverboat there as well. But their home stood where the Civic Center stands today. So there's nothing there, but there are some monuments marking that spot. Really, the Jones Mansion is one of the few that we can, at least here in Tazewell, say we know that was.
Where's that one located at?
It is on the east side of Tremont. I don't have the address offhand. I apologize. But it's if you Jones Mansion or I'm sorry here. If you type in John Albert Jones Tremont, you'll be able to get the address for it because it's a home that comes up. It's on actually the National Archives database as a historic home. It was something they got registered as a few years ago. But that's one that you can still drive around and see. Like I said, there is chance that some part of the greenhouse on Harding is part of that as well, but that one we can't verify. Uriah Crosby's home, his great-great-granddaughter wanted to see the foundation. Remember, it was a log cabin, so there's no foundation to be seen. You know, that's been plowed over so many times. There's Crandall Schoolhouse. There's really no foundation for that left. That's been plowed over so many times. So it is difficult to track some of these just because of how rudimentary the structure was during that time frame.
What are you talking about, time frame, 1830s to 1850?
1820s, it begins, the Underground Railroad through here. 1830s, 1840s, 1830s and 40s is where it really is the heaviest. By 1850, the national conversation gets really hot. We're leading into the Civil War, so traffic starts to slow on it. And then by the 1860s, with the war, it really kind of comes to a halt. So yeah, the prominent one that we're looking at is really 1830s, 1840s. Well, like with the story of Absalom Dylan, that would have been in the 1820s, early 1820s. Not here in Tazewell, again, down south, but they would have been coming through Tazewell from him. Other questions? Looks like you've got one.
Well, so I don't know, I mean, you've heard of the Underground Railroad, but I don't know any specifics about it.
Oh.
So how did these, you know, Crosby's, Roberts, et cetera, hook up? You know, how did that all work? And
Yeah, how exactly they all formed up, we don't know. Probably just social clubs, social gatherings, like-minded individuals talking. Hey, if you can get somebody from your home to mine, I'll help them get to the next home. We do know, again, they had a limited knowledge base of what the full system was. So Crosby knew that before him was Josiah Matthews, and they were coming out of Tremont, and after him was Kern and Washington.
that might have
But we
been
don't think that he knew much beyond that either way. Now, he may have known a few, but just by social gatherings. But there was no, okay, A to B to C to D. There was nothing like that. How did individuals find them? Runaway slaves and stuff? Just stories being passed along. We do know of courageous individuals like Harriet Tubman that went back into slavery to spread the story and then escape again, and continually keeps going back and forth. Those are extraordinarily rare individuals of great courage that did that. I don't know of that taking place really here. That would have been further south. By the time they get here, they're just in a system of individuals passing them. We do see that it follows certain churches, the Anabaptist churches that were established, especially here in the Morton area with the Mennonites and that. They would have communicated it. The Quakers, as they immigrate this way, especially in McLean County, there was a great Quaker establishment. They spread it amongst them that we're going to help these individuals out. So churches were deeply involved in this activity. But beyond that, again, it's such a secretive organization. We don't know exactly what got Uriah Crosby. How did he get involved? We don't have a start date or anything like that. We just know that he was involved, that he was in there. One thing with him too, now with what I just discussed, his daughter did confirm he really wasn't a religious, he was believed, but he wasn't part of any church. So he wasn't involved from the church. Just maybe he was an individual of deep character that believed that individuals should be sold as livestock. You are not an animal, you are a human being. She was very adamant about that and believes that personal belief is what drove him into it. But we don't know much more than that just because of the secretive nature. Some of the things too, when I mentioned, we talked about John Roberts' carriage being stopped and searched. We know it was almost stopped a second time. We know that they were following him and they knew they were being followed, and they had some individuals with them. We frown at the idea of blackface today, painting your face to look. He did the opposite. He had flour in there, so he took flour and threw it in their face to create whiteface, gave them guns, and said, let's go off hunting. So they stopped the carriage and went off hunting. Well, you wouldn't have given a slave a gun. That just couldn't happen. So these hunters going off coon hunting, well, they must be in the carriage. So the bounty hunters went to the carriage the whole time. Roberts was taking them to Crosby's farm on foot. So these routes, when I say they're not determined, there's a story where he just stopped and took them off in the woods coon hunting, quote unquote, and really walked them a new route all the way to there. So they'd switch up their routes. They were very, very scared the entire time that they would be caught and then what would happen. We know the Roberts, we know that they once took a trip right through Washington. It was election day, and so many people were coming in that they just threw a buffalo skin over the top of the hay and just drove them right through the middle of town, hoping that election day and all the festivities, no one will pay attention to a carriage going quickly. So they hurried up and made, so there, he didn't go to the east like he normally would and hook back around. He went directly through. There's there's no way for us to say that this is the path, because there was a lot of those just made up on the whim of, I think we need to do this today rather than, for this reason or that. So
The Roberts name, is that any association with Roberts Cemetery?
yes, his father is the one that donated the land, and all but Ambrose is buried there. As a matter of fact, we marked their graves with wreaths from the service event. We'll be putting the permanent markers there, but Ambrose left and moved to Iowa later in life, and he's buried in Iowa. Part of this effort as well is, finding their markers and marking them. If in the future Iowa should ever get interested in something like this, we would be happy to get something to them as well, but we're really just focusing on the individuals buried in Tazewell right now.
Is there a place to find, a list to find their grave sites for the ones we?
The easiest way to do it, and it's not easy, it does take some time and tracking, but is to type in the individual's name and find a grave. Find a Grave is a national website that does do a wonderful job of detailing what individuals are in what cemeteries. With the Roberts, I'll say not all of the Roberts family popped in, but since I knew that a couple of them were in Roberts Cemetery, I just pulled up Roberts Cemetery, find a grave, and it lists for you everybody in the cemetery. So then I was able to hit the Roberts and find that all of them but Ambrose was buried there. And it also then, once they created a family tree there, you can start spinning off of that. So like Ambrose, it tells you exactly where his grave is in Iowa. Well, that helps me, finish that off. So if you type in his father's name, it shows him and his wife. Then it shows all of his kids, all of his siblings, his brothers and sisters as well. So you can start to go off a family record that way. It's a lot of hunting and searching. It takes a while. But yeah, you're able to do that. And then when we get to the cemetery, it can be difficult because some of the cemeteries aren't as, the conditions aren't as nice as others. So some of them have aged quite a bit, and finding their actual marker, there may not be a cemetery board caring for that anymore. It can be a difficult task. Absalom Dylan actually was one of the hardest ones for me to find. Not because of poor maintenance, but because there's nobody to contact anymore. So you're seeing a picture of what they found to be his marker and trying to, all right, of all these in this field, which one is it? Trying to get that. So it can be a difficult process, but that's been the greatest reference for actually finding their markers themselves, is that Find a Grave website. Unfortunately, when you type in a name, the more common the name, the more likely it is that there's multiples across the United States. So that's also part of the problem, is tracking down exactly which one I'm looking for. You try different combinations and codes and figure it out after a while.
Is there any other homes in Morton that I've heard of that possibly?
Not in Morton. It's torn down now, but Jay Ackerman's barn, so across from the block house, that's there. The block house wouldn't have been there during this time frame. That was later. But that barn is believed to have been from that time frame. That could have been. No documentation, don't know. I imagine there's a couple other old barns of that nature. Circleville, a lot of it, that doesn't even exist as a town today, but their foundation's still there. So a couple of the foundations could have been locations. Unfortunately, Dr. Cheever and his building isn't there anymore, but there is a marker for the building where it was at, and that was the foundation of the Union League, where that organization's birth was. His father's home and George Teff's home have been destroyed in Tremont. Both of them are torn down, farmland. So no, nothing else that especially here in Morton, that I could put a stone to. The only rumored one that could be is the foundation, the original foundation for the Green Farmhouse on Harding Road. And again, that's at this point not confirmed at all. That's just legend.
What area was this, Circleville? Where is that at?
Circleville is South Pekin. If you go south of there, Circleville was a community that existed there, heading towards Delavan. right before the Mackinac River. It's up on the top of from there. There was a saloon boarding house there that we know Lincoln stayed at a couple times. There were prominent abolitionists in the community during Lincoln's time on the circuit, so that was one where we know that he stayed there. Later in life became quite a rowdy town. There's a book, Lynch Law, about a gang that existed down there that later was the gentleman was hanged in Pekin, lynched in Pekin, for murdering an individual in Circleville. So the town had kind of a ruckus reputation later in life. Today, that all that exists is some foundations, a Circle Drive, and two homes are currently there, two farms, but not from that era.
What's that called? Is that part of?
Circleville, not part of Delavan. I believe that would be. I'd have to look it up. I wouldn't want to say, but it's. I don't know if it's in Malone Township or if I don't think it's Malone. I believe that it's Spring Lake, but I'm not positive on that. It's between those South Pekin and the Mackinac River there. Any other questions? Well, I appreciate your time. I hope I didn't drag on too long or anything. Hopefully this
No,
is
you did great.